Welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. I'm Roshan Karyappa. My guest today is Pratik Podar, who is a principal at Nexus Venture Partners. Pratik has been associated with some of the most sterling startup successes in recent times. He's invested in White Hat Junior, Rapido, Pratilipi, Turtlemint, and so on. On this podcast, we spoke about his perspective on early stage investing, how the edtech sector has evolved over the last 5 or 6 years, the unique aspects about some of the consumer content businesses that he's invested in, and really the principles that go into decision making and what the future holds for us. This was a fantastic conversation, quite wide ranging on all things startup and investing. I hope you like it. Hey, welcome to the Startup Operator Podcast. Pratik, thanks so much for making the time.
Pleasure is all mine. Thank you.
So I guess before we begin, I guess congratulations are in order because Quizzes raised Series A, and then Turtlemint again has raised about 46 million in Series D. So congratulations on that.
We have been lucky to partner with exceptional entrepreneurs, and of course the market is hot right now, and a lot of companies are able to raise at a good valuations.
I think you're being far too modest, but hopefully we will break open that shell in the course of this conversation, right? So for all the listeners, just talk about your journey. Especially your stint over the last 6 years at Nexus. I think you started as an associate and now you're a principal. It's been about 6 years at the firm. How has that journey been?
Yeah. So I graduated from college as a hardcore computer science engineer. I wanted to be on the math side. I didn't even want to be the on the coding side. And I thought that was my destiny. Wanted to do a PhD in math, but for different reasons did not want to go outside India, and ended up joining Morgan Stanley Quant Group in Mumbai. A very interesting role. It's fantastic folks. Wanted to do a startup after that, and people advised me I should get some business experience before I do that, because I was only thinking of problems as math problems and not really business problems. So I ended up joining Blackstone Private Equity, super smart folks, but moved out soon and started my first company. It was in social commerce. Social commerce. In those days, social commerce was less about reselling and transactions. It was more around community around commerce. That did not work out. It was too early for India market. Built a content marketing company, which became a good business, but was not scaling very fast then. Uh, uh, I did freelancing on the side in between, and was freelancing for a Nexus funded company. And when I wanted to move out of my startup life after 3 years of back and forth and doing a lot of experiments, I joined Nexus then. So joined Nexus about 6 years back, and the ride has been phenomenal. I Nexus is a very horizontal firm. We are not divided as much by spaces. It's a smaller firm in terms of number of people, so I had more flexibility. It was more entrepreneurial playground for me to explore what I enjoy and learn from smarter entrepreneurs and other folks in the team who have been more experienced both in investing and company building. So honestly speaking, I didn't know that I had the intent to be in the firm for so long. Having been Because I was moving around a bit before then. I had done quant, private equity, algo trading, startup as a CTO, startup as a CEO, freelancing, everything in the first 5 years after graduation. I will be lying to myself if I knew if I say that I knew I want to be. I decided to be at Nexus forever. But hey, I've been here for 6 years now, and been learning from exceptional entrepreneurs, and growing with them. Uh, was fortunate to be working with and investing in Pratilipi, Turtlemint in the first year itself, and learned a lot from the founders, and developed interests in a few spaces. Over time, ended up investing in White Hat, Rapido, Quizzes, Newton School, and the journey has been exciting. I don't know what more I could ask for.
Right. Yeah, many different facets, from being a computer science guy, then a quant guy, then a business guy, and now, on the VC side of things. I think Sridhar Vembu has often spoken about this also. I think he was also pursuing or planning to pursue a PhD in physics and then gave it up to solve real world applications, as he says, right? Uh, so one of the most obvious questions is there are so many good founders out there, right? But even then, I mean, it's a limited pool of founders, limited pool of investable startups as such, right? How do you compete to work with the best and the brightest of them?
Yeah, so I think there's natural selection in some sense. So we are fortunate enough to to get a chance to meet exceptional entrepreneurs who are willing to share their dreams with us and tell their stories and really open up to us. I think as a firm, because of the history and the successes we have had, I think we have been fortunate to get a chance to to really evaluate a fit in terms of personality, in terms of ethics, in terms of value systems, and then work with the entrepreneurs we think we can add a lot of value, and the entrepreneur thinks we can add a lot of value, and it would be a fun ride working together. I think every day when I'm waking up, I think investing is a is a job for fortunate people that way, that every day so many people who are very excited, motivated about what they are doing are talking to me, explaining their business models, explaining their creativity, and we are fortunate that we can really decide which type of companies we want to work with, and then of course best entrepreneurs will have access to work with all the VCs, because at the end of the day money is commoditized, and that's where the influence we can have, and the trust and the empathy we can develop for the founder helps us win the deal.
Right. I've spoken to multiple entrepreneurs on the podcast earlier, and one of the common attributes that comes across, or rather characteristics that comes across, is that investing is both an art and a science, right? You can't do the extra Excel extrapolation as such. Neither can you go into this with a very sort of a romantic frame of mind, right? So, uh, how does your background as a core computer science guy, as a quant guy, how does that play into your decision making? What are the certain biases that you are aware of? What do you guard against, and so on? Just take us through your principles and decision making as such.
Yeah. So, first of all, I think it's art, science, and luck. I would be, because the number of successes in the market are so low. I think luck has a very important role to play, at least right now. I'm sure over time it will be proven who is good, who is bad, when you have opportunity to show success multiple times. But today we do not have enough depth to prove smartness by successes. A lot of it is luck. On I'll be honest, I don't think my computer science experience or quant experience has a lot of role to play in true sense. However, my failing entrepreneurial experience definitely helps me visualize a few things that might not be visible to naked eye who has not have had that experience. So just the understanding whether how the founder is thinking about building a team, what is the relationship between the co-founders, what are the weak spots in the confidence that the person pitching is projecting, uh, just having the empathy towards why the founder would be doing what he's doing, and just associating with that, understanding when someone is tired and when someone is motivated. I think those small things which are more emotional and more gut feel based than numerical based. I think I feel that I can understand that well, just because of the experiences I have had before. Other than that, I think the science part of it, in true sense, VC firms teach you when you work in a VC firm, because it's really pattern matching around the founder, around the space, around what has worked earlier, what you think would work, and so on. And that is just a function of experience in the firm, and and having met maybe maybe 5,000 companies over the past 6 years. That pattern matching just gets developed, and it's just a function of companies you meet. It's and how fast you are training your algorithm in your mind. I think it's an easier problem to solve. But understanding the emotional part behind it is perhaps more difficult to build. Uh, and, uh, and maybe my entrepreneurial experience helps me there.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting that you mentioned that, right? Because I think everything else has been fairly benchmarked in terms of what metrics should be there, in terms of other things that go into other variables as such, right? But then what you spoke about, in terms of raw instinct, in terms of, hey, will this person succeed, or does this person have what it takes to succeed? I think that is something that you develop. And yeah, also very interesting that you talk about your founding experience, because I think Vinod Khosla has mentioned this earlier, that you don't earn unless you've been a founder, you shouldn't be a VC, something to that effect, right? That you won't really know how these decisions get made, and how things really work at startups. So
Yeah. But one caveat, I had not built a large startup.
right.
So a lot of things that startup building involves around how do you scale, how do you build your board, how do you fire and hire executives. I think a lot of those things I never had real startup building experience on, because my startups never scaled to those levels. But those learnings you'll get vicariously by working with founders that are
Sure.
scaling, and Nexus has been a good
Right.
place to learn those things.
Right. This episode is brought to you by Mulia. You want to move fast? Sure. But without breaking things? Now that's a hard ask. The thing is, once you have some base of users and customers, you just cannot afford to risk quality. So, how do the likes of Cred, Swiggy, and CureFit, some of India's fastest growing startups, ship at lightning pace and delight their users and customers? Simple, they're working with Mulia as a strategic quality partner. Mulia is India's most talented and passionate community of testers. They've helped prevent thousands of bugs and regression issues. So, as a CTO or a product owner, if you want to reduce tech debt, especially while you scale, do check out Mulia.com. I've interviewed Mulia's founder and CEO Pradeep on the podcast earlier, and we spoke about how startups can improve quality while scaling and things to that effect. You should definitely check it out. I'll link to it in the description below. Now back to your regular programming. So I want to pick up on something you mentioned earlier, which is that money is commoditized, right? So it's really everything else, and that point can be made more now than ever before, right? The fact that it's commoditized, and it's really everything else that goes into a deal or a partnership, really, that matters. So how are you actively building all of these, from your perspective? So when you write a check to a founder, or when you partner with a startup, what are the other three or four things that make the difference from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think see one thing I think that helps us over everyone else is that we are very very selective, and we are all in when we are doing a deal. So we are not doing spray and pray investments, and the founder can actually see it in our eyes. We will, when we are pitching to an entrepreneur that he should take money from us, we are going all in. It's not, well, this is one of the 50 investments, or one of the 25 investments that we are doing this year. For each one of us, this would be the deal of the year, or maybe deal of one of the two deals of the year. So that conviction, that passion, that sense of commitment comes out in the conversation, I hope. And the founder then, of course, at the end of the day, startup building is a very lonely journey, and the founder can see through it that we will be long term partners. We will not be fly by night partners that will be there in good times and run away in bad times. And 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 I think that's the ethos of the firm. And that's perhaps because everyone in the firm has been, or almost everyone in the firm has been an entrepreneur before. And so we believe in being very long term partners, and not taking spray and pray approach while doing very high conviction investments. And I think that shows to the founder. The second thing we do is that we ask anyone who we are investing in to do ref check. You should talk to our founders. You should understand where we did right, where we did not do right, and and hopefully our founders will give you the honest assessment of both the positive and negative things. We all do mistakes. It's okay. We'll work on it later. But the honesty in the relationship should be there from day one, and we actually communicate that to the founders, and I hope all the founders like it, and that is one of the reasons we are able to win deals in this competitive market as well.
Right. Uh, Again, you mentioned something which is, being together in good times and bad, right? And especially in the latter, I mean, being together in bad times becomes so much more important than when everything is hunky dory, right? When everything is good. Uh, so we are talking about it at a time when, last year things went topsy turvy, right? What were the immediate things that you communicated to your portfolio founders when COVID happened? When it looked like the end of the world, what are the two or three things that you told your portfolio founders?
So let's be honest that this was not something that we have ever seen. Any one of us has ever seen. In fact, this is not something that even our parents have seen.
Yeah.
So it is not a straightforward time to be in, and everyone was operating out of both fear and opportunity cost framework. Right? It was not a straightforward time to take decisions on. I think the I think the normal things to do at that point of time, depending on the runway you have, the burn you have, the impact you have in the short term, and impact you expect to have in the long run, could be could be varied. It could be either reducing costs, it could be either pressing the pedal, it could be fundraising, it could be focusing on revenues more and focusing on growth less. It could be different for different companies. I think the key thing to do at that point of time is to increase communication with employees, with partners, with customers, with investors. It's important to just communicate exactly what is happening, and I think many of my founders did fantastic job there, where they we are all operating in very uncertain time, but the founders did a fantastic job ensuring that the entire team, customer, partner, investors, everyone is working with them together, and helping them get out of it. I think that was one good thing that, looking back, a lot of companies did. The second thing we could do, which is not as easy to do, and of course everyone would hate founders and investors when these things are happening. But in some businesses where the impact was very high, you had to take hard steps. You had to take hard steps in terms of letting some people go, shutting down some businesses, and in some cases reducing salaries and so on. Again, I think a lot of this is the cost of doing business, and some companies who did that better fared out much better. And when the times are good, it seems the right thing to do. Of course, at that point of time, it seemed very difficult and very
Hmm.
heart wrenching. But in the end, we are all working for this organism called the company, and all of us are trying to ensure that this company survives and grows. And looking back, uh, many founders did a fantastic job there, and I think constant communication, constant reassurance was very important in those times, and ensuring that everyone is able to take the tough calls when it's needed.
Right.
I think uncertainty just gets the best out of people,
Hmm.
best or worst out of people.
Yeah.
And you could see the signs of that in everyone, in board members, in founders, in employees,
Yeah.
and just navigating through it was very challenging. But I am actually very surprised and amazed at the maturity that the ecosystem showed. And of course, some spaces that did very well, like at tech, payments, etc. Of course, entrepreneurs in those spaces scaled their companies to next level and moved in the next orbit. And in spaces where it was more challenged, the founders hunkered down and ensured that they have food for the winter, and they can come out when the times are better.
Right. Yeah, I've been talking to founders over the last many months, and one thing that stood out is the amount of ingenuity that people have shown. Right. I mean, overnight revenue streams have been created. Overnight, different product lines have been created, so on and so forth. And yeah, I mean, it's been a remarkable time actually.
And
Uh,
you would be surprised that you later realize that, hey, I
why
could
was
have done a lower cost or higher revenue, and all I needed was a jolt, and I was
right?
not taking the tough calls just because it was easy earlier. Uh,
Yeah,
and you actually sometimes thank that you were able to take those tough calls then,
yeah.
and actually emerge as a better company post COVID than pre
Yeah.
COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's pushed us to, revisit all of the conventional stuff that we have assumed, right, as way of doing business, and really rethink everything from first principles in some sense. So, yeah. Now, before I jump into some of the specific sectors that you invested in, everyone says they like big markets, where technology can streamline things, add value, all of those things, right? I mean, all the good things about those markets. What are some non-obvious things that you look for in markets that really excite you? I mean, that basically move the needle for you.
Yeah, so one is the straightforward part where you know that the market size is large, you know that it is perhaps ready for disruption. Of course, there would be some operational challenges because of which it would not be straightforward. But but at least the market in many cases is more visible. However, I think one sector, I think one filter I sometimes keep for some spaces is that unsexy spaces at the cusp of beginning of the wave are sometimes very interesting because everyone thinks that those markets are not large enough, but the market is just about to be created, or the founder is will create that market, and that market is unsexy, and that is why it will be non-competitive, and the founder will have the time and resources to build it while no one else will get that time and resources, and it will be very exciting. So if you think about it, White Hat, the market they were operating in, that's kids coding space, uh, that market seemed small from outside, but the founder was about to create that market, and there was an underlying wave that people wanted to teach their kids new skills, new age skills, and of course it would be outside in analysis would show that the market is small, but the founder's gut feel and conviction would tell you that the market size could be large. And I think exceptional outcomes are created in unsexy spaces where not everyone can easily visualize that the market is large, and when of course everyone can see it, then valuations increase, and cost of building the company sometimes increases because lots of companies get financed,
Right.
and competing companies take away capital from each other.
Right. I mean, I was listening to Reid Hoffman, and on a podcast, he says that at the time that he wanted to build LinkedIn, it seemed so obvious to him. But then every smart person that he spoke to said this was a dumb idea, or that this wouldn't work. And instead of discouraging him, that actually motivated him, because he thought that, okay, the smart people will not solve this problem. Then it's mine for the taking in some sense.
Yeah.
So uh, so let's talk about edtech, right? I mean, you are associated with Unacademy, White Hat Junior, two of the most successful edtechs to come out of India in the last 5 years, I would say. You're on the board of Newton School. How has edtech changed in the last 5 years, and where do you see it going?
So, I say this often that I distinctly remember 5, 6 years back, the argument people would make is that people in India will not pay for content, or or edtech content is commoditized and no one will make money here. That was the prevalent argument 5, 6 years back, and we had a lot of interesting companies that were not scaling and were not able to raise then. I think what changed for the past 5 years is as internet penetration increased, as payment penetration increased, and as higher quality content started to get created, because teachers now knew how to create high quality content online. We just saw a big shift in the way people think about education online. And of course, COVID just pushed the boundary, and we are 3 4 years ahead of what we were supposed to be in terms of penetration and the trust the world would have on online education. So we are definitely at the point where tech companies are scaling very fast. And I say this often, that tech is one space where there is both scale and monetization. Some
Mm.
companies have scale and non-monetization. Some companies have monetization but not scale. EdTech has both scale and monetization, and the largest companies in EdTech companies will be amongst the largest companies in the country in
Yeah.
the tech space. Uh, Now, going forward, I think at some level, Byju's and an academy have proved to be leaders in their space, and have been very aggressive in going after allied markets and are scaling fast. Uh, I I think over time, a lot of obvious spaces should be taken by larger players, because they have cost advantage in customer acquisition,
Mm.
and they have cost advantage in content delivery. However, the newer companies that will get created should be starting with a very unique entry point,
Mm.
where uh, where uh, where the demand perhaps is not as proven, but once you get a entry using a wedge, then you expand from there and create a large company. But the entry point in my mind will be very non-obvious and unique. And I'm very hopeful in that lots of very large tech companies will be created from India over the next decade. Uh, but the mistake we could do is do copy paste models,
Mm.
and try and copy what have been done in US and China and build it for India. India has unique problems, and India has unique advantages. So best to go after that, and capture those markets and build large companies.
So, I think with EdTech, it's the classic bundling and unbundling that's happening, right? I mean, e-commerce, for example, I don't know if too many people remember how many Amazon ripoffs were there 10 or 15 years back in India, right? And today you have that massive consolidation, and anyone who's building a store, whatever, is penetrating through a niche. And I think something similar is going to happen with EdTech as well, with Unacademy, Byju's consolidating. I mean, you hear of acquisitions almost on a weekly basis right now. So, yeah. And uh, what has been your experience on the impact that it's had on the teacher front, the supply base as such? Because it's not very often talked about, but I think the impact on teachers is tremendous, right? Because teaching essentially was a job that did not scale, right? If you were a great teacher, then you would probably, like, be signed up at an institute, and you would do those mindless 12 or 14 or 16-hour days, right? And that was your way to riches. And it was always I always noticed two types of teachers, right? So one, the really idealistic types who had all the options and said, you know what, I'm going to go into teaching because I want to give back to society, or things to that effect. And then you had the other side, which is like, kahin pe job nahi mila, to I mean, let me become a lecturer at least, right? But I think going forward, what all of these edtech guys have enabled is a huge shift in terms of like the top 30-40% of this pool thinking that, hey, you know what, I can actually make a viable career out of being a good teacher, right?
Yeah, I agree. In fact, many of my ex-teachers
Hmm.
are now actually teaching on an academy, and White Hat and Newton School, and I know their experiences on how their lives have changed,
Hmm.
especially during COVID times, because their offline business were not really working.
Hmm.
And at that point of time, they could see, and they were forced to just evaluate these options, and they are actually very happy that they are able to get a lot of student love, which is very, very important for them.
Mm.
Convenience, because teaching is a very hard job,
Yeah.
and it requires tremendous focus, tremendous passion, tremendous energy, and they are able to do this more efficiently on all of these online companies,
Mm.
and they are actually making more money than they were making earlier. So it actually works out very, very well for them.
Yeah.
Uh, I think teaching is a job that cannot be commoditized. Every
Absolutely.
teacher is unique. Every teacher comes with his passion and energy, and a lot of these online platforms just helps the teacher scale that and deliver that to far flung areas, and this is better for the ecosystem. The supply is ready, the demand was hungry, and you just connected them and ensured that magic is being created.
Yeah. No, I think teachers are going to be some of the richest people over the next 5-10 years. I think going forward, right? The other aspect is like imposing all of the growth pressures that a typical VC business has, right? Do you think that's kind of sustainable in education? Because typically, we have this idea of like, hey, you know what, every child is unique and different people have different learning paces and so on. There is no cookie cutter model as such, right? Or at least people want to move away from that cookie cutter sort of a model. So, how do you think the edtech companies will address that specific challenge?
Yeah, so you're right. However, I think you're thinking of edtech as one to many people uh, broadcasting of information and nothing else.
Hmm.
I think if that was the case, then you are right. But in my mind, edtech is actually even more personalized than what offline individual coaching could have been, because
Interesting.
you are using technology to assess and improve and learn offline as well. B, you could have peer-to-peer learning even better here, because you could create communities of students learning with each other and growing together. C, you can actually have project-based learning where one very, very high quality teacher is doing that broadcast thing, but there are mentors or teaching assistants who are helping you handhold during the projects and helping you deliver outcomes. So in my mind, edtech is actually more scalable,
Hmm.
and in some and weirdly enough, more personalized than the offline education companies that were there.
So, the other business that and the other sector that you have sort of invested in, right, is the consumer content businesses. And here again, I mean, you have Pratilipi, you have Quizzes, which we talked about earlier, Mitron, and the others, right? Um, how do these businesses work? Are there some common principles in understanding these businesses, and uh, like before you invested in them, what makes these businesses investable?
Yeah. So, uh, very difficult question because every company is very unique. But let me share some broad principles that I have used. First is that because of the fund size we operate in and the expected outcomes, we have stayed away from pure publisher businesses. We have been more excited about platform plays and content.
Hmm.
The second thing we wanted to do is understand the depth of the community. If the community is strong and the content is differentiated, then only you would have long term retention and long term engagement in the platform. So these were some of the broad principles we used. However, I would be lying if I say that we knew the answers for all these companies. At the end of the day, the stage we come in, it's really about the founder and the bet on the founder's conviction and his ability to iterate and his ability to build a team. And again, when you meet these founders, you've done the podcast with Ranjit earlier. You know
Hmm.
that he is exceptional, and it's obvious that when you meet him, you have to invest in him, and it's very, very straightforward because of who he is, and everything that when we invested in Papilipi, it was a very, very small company, but the founders were just very, very passionate about the problem they were solving, and and it was almost like a mission statement for them that they wanted to solve the problem for the authors, and the company has made phenomenal progress over the past 5 6 years since we invested.
Right. Yeah, I mean, Ranjit is a great guy, right? I mean, and when you meet people like that, you realize that this problem that this guy is solving, he is probably the only guy who can solve it, right? Because they just bring something so unique to it, and it's apparent when he shares his perspective of the business and so on, right?
And it's amazing,
Uh,
by the way, that you would think that Ranjit articulates well now when the company has scaled. The reality is that he spoke the same words and the same language, and nothing in his articulation has changed in the past 5 6 years. He
right.
exactly had the same vision, and he's just executing on that just flawlessly. Uh, uh, and
Amazing.
and I think when you meet him, when you had met him then, and when the company was very small, but the ideas were that big, you knew you wanted to work with him and invest in.
Right. So, any other sectors and opportunities that you think getting more relevant now post COVID? I mean, edtech we've covered, and of course the consumer content business as such. Any other that you think will become super relevant that we're probably missing at this point?
So yeah, I always say that if I knew the space, then almost surely everyone knows about that space, and if everyone knows about that space, then no large company will perhaps get created because everyone will eat away profits from everyone. I do not think about space first. We genuinely always think about founder first. However, we are of course looking at the trends in the ecosystem and what is happening. I think a few things are changing in the underlying ecosystem. One, because of increase in payment penetration, a lot of things that were not monetizable earlier will become monetizable now. So that is a mega trend on top of which new companies should get created. Second, I would argue is that with Geo WhatsApp type partnership, you can imagine that more SMEs will come online now than were online earlier, and because of that, new opportunities should get created,
Yeah.
and definitely worth keeping an eye on that. The third trend I'm seeing is that just because of perhaps the experience or some of the successes, now Indian founders are feeling much more confident about aggressively going after global consumer markets. We did not see that as much 4 5 years back, but now perhaps the times are changing because Indian product quality has improved and founders have just become more audacious and are willing to take that path. So because of the underlying infrastructure change and underlying confidence shift, we should see more global companies being created out of India. Like for example, Quizzes and Ultrahuman and Splash Math and White Hat. So many interesting examples of consumer companies being created out of India. Of course, there were a lot of enterprise tech companies since many years. They're early investors in Dhruva and Postman and Hasura. Lots of enterprise tech companies and developer first companies were being created. But for the first time, we are seeing consumer companies winning in global markets, and that should be an exciting trend.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. Yeah. So, while we are talking about different sectors and so on, VC investing itself is under a lot of flux, obviously, right? Plenty of changes undergoing. How do you see the next 10 years playing out for the Indian VC?
Yeah, I actually, so today there are many high quality angels in the system who actually support the company at idea stage. Uh, VCs like us and some smaller VCs which are effectively operating seed funds or angel funds, all of us are also very aggressive going after companies at early stage, pre-product market fit, post-product market fit. I think there is some lack of capital at the Series B, Series C stage, in the sense that
Yeah.
number of investors at that stage are perhaps lower. At higher stages, Series E, D, E, I think there is again more availability of capital, but there is some lack of capital at the middle stage, in my opinion, and more funds will come in that category because everyone can see that opportunity. Uh, Almost surely, because more global funds are looking to come to India, we should see more action and more competition at early stages because lots of teams are being created, lots of new firms are being started, and because some firms who have been there since last 10, 15 years have seen some successes, more global appetite to invest is coming in. The uh, and this is all very good for the ecosystem because it just increases competition, increases liquidity. Good for the entrepreneur that the capital availability will be faster, and the risk appetite on the ecosystem will increase because that also means that liquidity will be faster, and some companies will fail, but the companies that succeed will be giving astronomical returns because the market is just more mature. Uh, I think once we have a few successes in the IPO market, which should happen in the next 2 3 years, then the confidence of global investors will increase even more, and we should see more supply of capital in India market. And it's a more competitive world to live in, and understandably, the firms which have been in the market since last 14 15 years, we have a brand name, we have trust in the ecosystem. We should be able to continue to have access to high quality entrepreneurs, but we should not take it for granted because understandably money is commoditized and competition will increase, and we have to eat what we kill every day and work hard for successes every day.
Right. Yeah, I see a lot of like early stage activity, right? Like seed and even like pre-series A types, as you mentioned. I mean, a lot of people writing checks these days at that mark, less than a million or even maybe like a million-ish, right? And obviously, you have the likes of Tiger coming in or Mirai and others, investing that Series D, Series E sort of, 50 million, 100 million types. So, final question to you, and it's been a fascinating conversation thus far, right? Plenty of different things we've covered. Final question: if you had to pick like top two or three IPOs, which three companies would these be? And it can be a slightly like a wish list also. But if you were to pick three for IPO, which one would you be? Whose stocks would you buy?
Yeah, so Pragmatic, of course, did an IPO recently, and we are very, very bullish on the company. I'm very bullish on Delivery because it is the market leader. It's effectively the bet on e-commerce in India because Delivery is the horizontal player really
Correct. Yeah.
working with all e-commerce players, and it's a great bet for the global investors as well. So Delivery, I'm bullish on. I'm bullish on Zomato because it's a leader in the food delivery space. Food delivery space has been growing globally. Meituan, DoorDash, the stocks have been doing phenomenally well. So I'm very bullish on Zomato because the economics were better, and the company is growing fast. And the founder has shown. Yeah, I think those are
Yeah.
the things that I like. But I'm sure there are more other companies. I just don't have enough context about them because I'm
Right.
not very close to them. But I'm sure there are many other companies that would be shining in the IPO market.
Right. Super. This has been a really fascinating conversation, Pratik. Again, thank you so much for spending time with us, and hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Awesome. Thank you, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you so much for listening. If you liked this episode, then don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite platform and share this episode with all of your fellow startup operators. Also, follow the Startup Operator on LinkedIn and Twitter for more updates. Stay safe, take care, and see you soon on a brand new episode of the Startup Operator.